I was standing at the kitchen window when I heard my son's car pull into the driveway. I knew that sound. 32 years of listening to cars come and go from this house, and I still knew every engine, every creak of the gate, every particular way gravel shifts under a set of tires. That's what happens when you build something from nothing. You memorize every detail of it without even trying. My son Everett got out first, then his wife Naomi. She was wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. And she had that way she carries herself when she's decided something, chin forward, shoulders back, like she's walking into a meeting she already knows she's going to win. I set down my coffee mug. I wasn't scared. I want to be clear about that. I was 64 years old. I'd buried a business partner who tried to steal from me. I'd survived a market crash that wiped out half my competitors, and I'd raised 2 children, mostly on my own after my wife passed. Fear wasn't really what I felt standing there watching them come up the front path. What I felt was tired. Tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Let me back up. Because none of this makes sense without the before. I grew up in Decatur, Illinois. My father worked nights at a grain processing plant, and my mother took in alterations. We weren't poor exactly. We had what we needed. But I understood from very early on that money doesn't appear. You make it. You protect it. You don't talk about it. That lesson stayed with me. I moved to Phoenix at 23 with $4,000 and a contact name written on a napkin. The contact never panned out, but I found work in commercial real estate anyway, starting at the absolute bottom. I was the guy who cleaned up properties between showings, who drove clients to sites in a car with a broken air conditioning in Arizona summer heat. I learned the business from the ground up because there was no other direction available to me. By the time I was 35, I had my own small firm. By 45, I had a regional reputation. By 55, I had quietly accumulated a portfolio that would have surprised most people who knew me, because I lived the same way I always had, modestly, carefully, without ceremony. My son Everett never had to think about any of that. And I don't say that as criticism. I say it as a fact. He grew up comfortable because I made it comfortable. He went to a good university, graduated with decent grades, married Naomi, who came from money herself, and they settled into a life in Scottsdale that looked very successful from the outside. I paid for the down payment on their house. I didn't tell many people that. My daughter Laurel, she's 4 years younger than Everett, took a different path. She moved to Portland, worked in nonprofit administration, married a quiet man named Peter who teaches middle school science. They have 2 kids and a house that needs new gutters, and they are, as far as I can tell, genuinely happy. Laurel calls me on Sunday afternoons. We talk for a long time. Everett calls when he needs something. I recognized that pattern a long time ago. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Parents always tell themselves that. The trouble started, as it often does, with a house. Not my house, my other property, a lakefront home in Prescott that I'd owned for almost 20 years. I bought it as an investment, held it, watched it appreciate. Over the years, it became a place where the family gathered in summer. The kids grew up swimming off that dock. My wife used to sit on the back porch in the evenings and watch the water. After she passed, I went there less. It felt different without her. But I hadn't sold it, and I hadn't promised it to anyone. That last point matters. About 8 months ago, Everett and Naomi started coming around more often. Dinners, weekend visits, things they'd never prioritized before. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. Or I used to not be. Then one Sunday, over a meal Naomi had cooked, which itself should have told me something because Naomi had never once cooked a meal in my house before, Everett brought up the Prescott property. "You're not really using it," he said. "It's sitting there. We've been talking about the market up there, and honestly, Dad, it makes more sense for us to take it over. We could manage it, use it for a few years, eventually build equity." I looked at him across the table. "Take it over," I said. "You know what I mean. We take care of it, like officially. You're asking me to give you the property." He looked at Naomi. That look. The kind where the conversation has already happened somewhere else, and this is just the performance of it. We're asking you to think about the future, Naomi said. Her voice was very smooth. You're not getting any younger, and it would simplify things enormously to start transferring assets while everything is straightforward, while you're still competent. That's what she didn't say. I told them I would think about it. I didn't sleep well that night. I have a friend. I've known him since we were both young men trying to figure out commercial leasing in a city that didn't care about us, named Theodore. Wait, he goes by Ted, 67 years old, sharp as he's ever been, and the kind of person who tells you what you don't want to hear because he respects you enough to do it. I called Ted the next morning and told him about the dinner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They're not asking for the property, Sal. They're telling you they're watching the property. My name is Salvador. People call me Sal. I should have said that earlier." I told Ted I thought he was being dramatic. He said, "Maybe. Call your attorney anyway." I did. My attorney's name is George Huang. He's been handling my affairs for 11 years, and when I described the conversation, his response was measured but direct. He told me that the language Naomi had used, transferring assets while everything is straightforward, was a phrase he'd heard before, usually in situations where adult children were beginning to lay groundwork. He told me to be careful about what I signed, what I said, and who I said it to. He also told me to update my estate documents, which I hadn't done since my wife passed. I made an appointment. 2 weeks later, Everett called. He said he and Naomi had found a financial advisor, someone they trusted, who had reviewed my situation and felt strongly that a formal family trust should be established with joint oversight. He used words like continuity of care and legacy protection. He said the advisor had seen too many cases where aging parents lost assets to bad decisions or outside influence. I said, "What outside influence?" There was a pause. "Laurel's been talking to you a lot lately," he said. I set the phone on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up again. "Your sister calls me on Sundays," I said. "She has for years. I'm just saying that people can be influenced without realizing it." I got off the phone as quickly as I could manage without sounding like what I was, which was furious. That night, I drove out to Ted's house and sat on his back porch and told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "They're going to try to get legal control of your finances. Maybe not right away, but that's where this is heading." I asked him how he was so certain. He said, "Because Naomi's brother went through this with his father-in-law 3 years ago, I know the playbook." I went home and I started doing something I'd never done before. I started paying attention. I went through my records. I had, at that point, assets distributed across several entities: the real estate portfolio, 2 investment accounts, the Prescott property, and the house I live in here in Phoenix. I also had liquidity that Everett didn't know about, because I had never felt the need to share that information with my children. My total net worth at that point was somewhere in the range of $9 million. Everett knew about maybe $2 million of it, maybe less. I'd never lied to him. I'd simply never volunteered the full picture. There's a difference. I'd learned a long time ago that telling people exactly what you have changes how they see you, and sometimes how they see themselves around you. I called George Huang and I told him I wanted to restructure. He understood immediately. He's a very good attorney. Over the following 6 weeks, I moved carefully. I established a revocable living trust with myself as sole trustee and Laurel as successor trustee. I documented everything through George, every asset, every account, every property. I had the Prescott home appraised and listed the beneficial ownership through the trust. I restructured my investment accounts under the trust umbrella. I did this quietly. I told Ted. I told Laurel eventually. She cried a little and told me she was sorry things had gotten to this point, and I told her it wasn't her fault and meant it. I didn't tell Everett. Meanwhile, he and Naomi continued their campaign. There were more dinners, more conversations about planning for the future. At Christmas, Naomi mentioned that she had a contact, a physician, she said, who did cognitive assessments for estate planning purposes. Very routine, she explained. Just something to have on record. I looked at her across the table and I said, "That's very thoughtful, Naomi. I'll keep it in mind." I kept my voice even. My father taught me that. When someone is trying to rattle you, stillness is the only weapon that actually works. In January, the letter arrived. I almost didn't open it right away. It was a legal envelope. George Huang's firm wasn't the return address, and something in the weight of it made me put it on the counter and stand there for a moment before I touched it again. It was a petition, filed in Maricopa County. Everett and a co-petitioner, a name I didn't recognize, some associate of his, I assume, were requesting a guardianship and conservatorship hearing. They were claiming I showed signs of cognitive decline, financial vulnerability, and susceptibility to undue influence. The undue influence, by implication, was Laurel. I read it twice. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I read it a third time. I'm going to try to describe what that moment felt like, and I don't think I can do it completely. It wasn't rage. Would have been simpler. It was something more like grief. The particular grief of recognizing that a person you raised, a person you loved and protected and worked for, had looked at you and seen only an obstacle, a problem to be managed. An old man with assets who needed to be moved aside. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said. She would have told me to be smart. She always said that. Don't get emotional, Sal. Get smart. I made 2 phone calls, one to George Huang, one to Ted. Then I went to bed because I knew I was going to need to be clear-headed, and I couldn't afford to spend the night catastrophizing. George filed a response within 48 hours. He also, quietly, requested a status hearing that got us in front of a judge faster than Everett's team had anticipated. George had done this for 20 years. He knew the local courts, he knew the process, and more importantly, he knew exactly what documentation destroyed a bad faith guardianship claim. We had neuropsychological testing done by a physician of my choosing. I scored in the 91st percentile for my age group across every cognitive domain they measured. The physician said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that my cognition was excellent and there was no clinical basis whatsoever for the claims in the petition. George submitted that report along with 5 years of financial records, a certified accounting of all assets, and a letter from my estate planner confirming that all recent restructuring had been conducted at my direction, with full legal oversight and with no outside influence. The petition was dismissed at the preliminary hearing. The judge, I won't describe her in detail because I don't think it matters, looked at the filing and looked at the response and said, without much warmth, that the evidence did not support the claims and that the petition appeared to have been brought without adequate basis. Everett was sitting across the room from me. He didn't look at me once. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've thought about it a lot and I don't want to make myself sound better than I am. I was angry. After the hearing, walking out into that flat January sunshine, I was genuinely, deeply angry. Not the hot kind, the cold kind that settles in and makes everything very clear. I called George from the parking lot and I said, I want to make changes. He said, I thought you might. I had already done most of the structural work before the petition, but there were 2 things I hadn't yet finalized. The first was the Prescott property. I had it listed within the week, not through any of the contacts Everett knew about, through a broker in Prescott who I'd worked with years ago. It sold in 19 days. A family from Colorado, cash offer, slightly under asking, closed fast. By the time Everett would have had any way of knowing it was on the market, it was already done. The second was a provision in my trust documents. I had George draft a clause, legal, clear, fully documented, that any beneficiary who challenged the trust, initiated legal action against my estate, or attempted to assert control over my assets during my lifetime would be removed as a beneficiary entirely. The clause specifically referenced the guardianship petition by case number. Laurel remains in the trust. Everett does not. I also updated my will. I made a substantial pledge to a scholarship fund at the university where I took my first real estate licensing course, the school where I learned that you could change your own life if you paid attention and did the work. It felt right. It felt like the money going somewhere it was supposed to go. I called Everett 6 weeks after the hearing. I kept it short. I told him I loved him because I do. That part doesn't go away just because everything else breaks. I told him that I was not angry, which wasn't entirely true, but was true enough. And I told him that I had made arrangements for my estate that reflected the choices he had made, and that I wished him well. He started to say something. I don't know what he was going to say. I told him I wasn't interested in a conversation about it, and I hung up. I sat in the quiet house for a while after that. It didn't feel like victory. I want to be honest about that too. It felt like a door closing, and even when a door needs to close, there's still the sound of it. It's been 9 months since the hearing. I'm sitting on the back porch of a house I rented for the summer, up near Flagstaff, not Prescott, somewhere new. And the air up here is cool in a way that Phoenix never is, even in August. And I can hear wind in the pines, and it sounds nothing like anything I've spent the last 40 years hearing. Laurel and her family came up last weekend. Her kids ran around in the trees, and her husband Peter helped me fix a screen door that had been bothering me since June. We ate dinner on the porch and stayed up later than any of us probably should have, and nobody talked about any of this, because there was nothing left to say that the four of us didn't already know. I'm not going to pretend I don't think about Everett. I'm his father. That doesn't stop. But I also think about something my father said to me once, when I was young and upset about something I can no longer remember. He said a man can only protect what he's actually willing to protect. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was about property, about money, about things. It isn't about things. It's about knowing what you value and not pretending you can keep it by looking away. I'm 64 years old. I built something from nothing. I protected it. I'm still here. That's enough. For now, that's enough. For now, that's enough. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the legal parts, not the paperwork, but the thing underneath all of it. What Everett didn't understand, what I don't think he was ever taught to understand, is that the choices you make toward people who trust you don't disappear, they accumulate. Every time he called only when he needed something. Every time Naomi steered a dinner conversation toward my assets. Every time he looked at me and saw a balance sheet instead of his father. Those weren't small moments. They were a direction. And directions, held long enough, become destinations. I'm not saying this to be harsh about my own son. I'm saying it because I watched it happen in slow motion and couldn't stop it. And the only thing that saved me, the only thing, was that I paid attention. Not to what he said, to what he did. There's a difference between a person who loves you and a person who values what you represent to them. I know that sounds cold. I spent most of my life not wanting to believe it applied to my own family. But when I read that guardianship petition, when I saw the words cognitive decline and susceptibility to undue influence written about me by my own son, the clarity that came with that was almost physical. Like something I'd been carrying for years finally set itself down. The irony is that Everett thought he was being smart. He thought he had found a shortcut, a legal mechanism that would let him skip the part where you actually earn things. He watched me build a life across 40 years and concluded that the building part was optional, that you could just file the right documents and arrive at the result without the work. That's not intelligence. That's the absence of it. Real intelligence understands that systems exist to protect people who actually deserve protection, and that those same systems will turn around and face you if you try to abuse them. I think about what I want to leave behind, and I mean that in a way that has nothing to do with money. What I want is for the scholarship fund I pledged to actually change someone's life. Some 23-year-old from a small city with $4,000 and a contact name that doesn't pan out, who figures it out anyway because they learned how. That's the transaction that matters, not assets moving from one account to another, knowledge moving from one life to another. Laurel understood something her brother never did, that showing up, really showing up, consistently without agenda, is the only currency that actually holds its value over time. She called on Sundays. She fixed the screen door. She cried a little when I told her the trust was in her name, not because of what it meant financially, but because she understood what it cost me to get there. If there's anything I'd want someone watching this to take away, it's that who you are when no one is watching, when there's no inheritance on the table, no estate to position yourself around. That's the only version of you that matters in the end. The rest is just paperwork. I'm 64. I'm sitting in the cool air above Flagstaff, listening to the pines. I built something. I protected it. And I'm still here to say so. That's enough.